السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. The first of the two topics for today's Essentials of Worship class is on congregational prayer. And the congregational prayer is one of the areas where there's a difference in ruling between the legislation for men and the legislation for women. With respect to men, the congregational prayer is the proper way for men to be praying, such that if men pray on their own without excuse, they're fulfilling the obligation, but the prayer is, they're not properly fulfilling what they have been commanded. They're not properly fulfilling what they're commanded, unless there is a reasonable excuse, right? And that's something we need to be aware of. And we'll be looking at the legal rulings related to the congregational prayer, but it's also important to be aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His command in the Quran to pray, we understand from it the praiseworthiness of congregational prayer, because the command has come in the plural. It has come in the plural. Both in encouragement, irka'u wasjudu. The command is to the collective, bow and prostrate. Now technically, if there's a command to the collective, to the plural, to do a plural act, it goes back to each person doing one act. Irka'u, all of us, all of you, prostrate. If each one bows and prostrates, they fulfill the command. But there's an indication there on the praiseworthiness of congregation. But that's made very clear in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where we see that a man's prayer in congregation has 27 times the reward of the one praying on their own. Right? And there's many hadiths related to that. You can find the related hadiths in Riyadh al-Salihin and so on. So that's with respect to men. With respect to women, the complete prayer for women is fulfilled by her praying on her own. There is no intrinsic merit in the Hanafi school in a woman praying in congregation. If she wishes to, she can. And there may be secondary benefits, such as being in a house of Allah, being with other believers, inspiration, etc. But there's no intrinsic merit in a woman praying in congregation. We'll also see that the minimum congregation is 2 people, right? And that's come in hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-ithnani fama fawqahuma jama'a. 2 and more are a congregation, right? And this is mentioned to be related in Sunan ibn Majah. Right? So if a husband and wife are the only 2 people at home, the husband and wife can pray in congregation, and the man will have the reward of the congregation for that, and the woman will have the reward of assisting in the congregation. Right? A congregation of a man and a discerning child, right? Would be a child who would pray the prayer from beginning to end, right? Typically 7 or older, could be younger than that if they would would normally pray properly, one has the reward of the congregation. However, the complete reward of the prayer is in the masjid, but the encouragement and emphasis of congregation is fulfilled by any congregation. But the optimal reward is in the masjid congregation or the public congregation. So, Babul Imama, the chapter on leading prayer. The author, rahimahullah, says, Al-jama'atu sunnatun mu'akkadatun lil-rijal. Congregation is an emphasized sunnah for men. Bila udhr, unless there is an excuse. Right, so it's an emphasized sunnah. And there's an opinion that it's wajib, that even if left once without excuse, it would be sinful, right? And others said that it's the highest emphasized sunnahs, not far from being wajib. And he said, bila udhr, unless there is a reasonable excuse, right? So if there's a reasonable excuse, which would be like, for example, sickness, right? Sickness, one has, difficulty getting to the congregation, right? Or someone has back trouble, let's say that's serious back trouble, not just like my back is stiff, but serious back trouble, and they just made wudu, they're going to lose their wudu. And it's difficult for them to make wudu because of their back trouble, raising their feet, etc. So there would be an excuse if someone is sick or there's undue hardship. However, they should have the sincere intention that had I been able to, I would have prayed in congregation. If they have that, they have the full reward of the congregation. Someone very elderly for whom it's a physical hardship to make it to congregation. Someone blind who can't make it to the congregation on their own, for example. If it's raining or it's muddy outside, such that one's clothes would get affected. Intense cold or intense dark, such that one fears for one's safety, right? But it has to be reasonable fear, right? It has to be reasonable fear. Or if one is holding off the desire, the need to go to the washroom, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ forbade praying when one's holding in the urge to use the washroom. Such that but that's only if one doesn't have waswasa, doesn't have misgivings, right? That you got up to pray and you have a strong need to go to the washroom, such that if you go, you'll go, right? If you prayed, you would be distracted by the thought, I need to use the washroom, then you should, because it's against the sunnah to hold it in. Or if someone is beginning their travel, right? So if you go pray in congregation, you're going to miss the flight. So you go. But it's recommended to try to catch a congregation even when traveling. Usually in airports and stuff, there are designated places for prayer, etc. And that's where the one who prepares gets things, manages to get things done. Like, especially if there's time. If you show up early to the airport, you can make it. And instead of being lazy about it, if one actually goes to the place of prayer, there's other people praying. If you can do that, that's encouraged. Or if you're taking care of a sick person, when they need you, right? The sick person's asleep and there's other people around. So we're all taking care of the sick person, right? That's making excuses, right? Right? Now, is work an excuse? This differs from a Muslim country to a non-Muslim country. And sadly, even in Muslim countries, many places, some countries, they don't give you time to go to congregation, right? So the optimal would be to go to the masjid to pray, which is why it's recommended that each neighborhood have a masjid. so that people at home or at work can comfortably make it, right, in their neighborhood to the masjid and get back without that disrupting their day to day. In even non-Muslim countries, if people thought about it, they would try to set up small musallas. Like, you know, it's expensive to build a whole masjid, but to set up prayer areas. Then they don't have to be fancy. So people in each neighborhood, they have a place where they can congregate, and that's meritorious. But at work, if there isn't a congregation one can make it to, like at a masjid right next door, etc., then if there are Muslims there, then one should at least strive to establish a congregation. And the one who does so has tremendous reward. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man sanna sunnatan hasana," whoever inaugurates a good sunnah, a good practice, has its reward and the reward of those who act upon it, without that diminishing their rewards in any way. And whoever inaugurates a bad practice has its sin and the sin of those who act upon it likewise, right? But if one's at work and one can neither make it to the masjid, nor is there a congregation at work, nor could one facilitate a congregation at work, then one should have within one that had I been able to pray in congregation, I would. And that's in making life decisions. Don't keep your religion in the margins, right? That, okay, will this choice of work or house facilitate my devotion, my religious duties, my upholding of the sunnah, etc., right? And that should be part of one's worldly decision making, right? And when unsure, it's good to consult. Okay, that's without excuse. So who should lead the prayer? He says, the person most deserving of leading the prayer is the most learned. Then the one with the best recitation. Then the most cautious in religious matters. Then the oldest. And there's other criteria as well that you can see in Nur al-Idah, etc. But the basis is that prayer requires knowledge. So the most learned, particularly the one who understands the rulings of prayer best, right? This is also important that in our masajid, who should we appoint for the masjid? People say, okay, we want someone dynamic, we want someone with a beautiful recitation. Firstly, the person entrusted to be leading the prayer needs to understand the fiqh of prayer, because it's an amana that they're doing it properly. So yeah, of course, they studied, right? And it should be something that even in our communities we should be investing in the skills of those serving the community, the imams of masajid, if there's a scholar in residence, if there's a youth counselor, right? That they be better able to serve the community religiously, right? And that's important, right? The Islamic says, let's do all these other things. How is the worship established, right? Is it in accordance with the teachings of our deen, right? So the most learned first. Then the one with the best recitation. And a good recitation is there's two levels of good recitation. A basic good recitation is one that is in accordance with the rules and principles of tajweed, of proper recitation. Yarhamukumullah. And then you have an excellent recitation, which is a recitation characterized by the characteristics of excellence, by the standards of tajweed, of proper recitation. Just having a beautiful voice is nice, but it's not a substitute for sound recitation or excellent recitation, because there's a criteria for it, which is the rules of tajweed, right? So in choosing, for example, if you're on the board of a masjid, right? Let's say you're not a specialist in tajweed. You want to hire somebody for that. You should look at, say, okay, yeah, they have a degree from some Islamic place, but it's good to involve someone learned in the interview process or the consultation process. But also, say, okay, how is this person's recitation? So, oh, mashallah, the congregation loved it. That's not the criteria, right? And yeah, having a nice recitation is good, but because typically if someone's leading the prayer, they may well also be teaching Quran in the community, etc. They may have a nice voice, but they don't know how to teach the Quran, because that's a skill. Then the most scrupulous, and this is the most cautious in religious affairs. This is the one with the most wara, and wara is, so taqwa, in fiqh terms, taqwa is being careful to avoid the haram. Wara, taqwa, to be God conscious, is to avoid the haram, avoid the things that are punishable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wara, scrupulousness, is to be careful not to do those things that are disliked or questionable. Right? And it's higher than taqwa. Then the oldest, because we've been commanded to respect our elders, right? But this is the order, the most learned. So a young person who's more learned and has better recitation has more right than a more pious person who's older in itself. Right? But these are 4 criteria to look at as well in terms of someone who would be in a position of religious teaching, etc. Right? How is their learning in general? How's their knowledge base in general? Number 2, how is their particular religious skill set related to the matter at hand? So for leading prayer, how is their recitation? But for teaching, how are they as a teacher? But by what? Oh, people love their teaching. No, by the standards of effective teaching Islamically. So it's good to... Then, how are they in terms of their scrupulousness? Can you just tell somebody, oh, he looks really scrupulous, mashallah? Can you tell just like that? No, you need to consult about that as well. Right? So, believers are people of principle. Right? Believers are people of principle. And then the oldest. And that's a criteria, that if all else being equal, we defer to those elder. Right? And then there's secondary considerations, like who has better character, because people are more likely to want to pray with them, and so on. It's disliked. Now some people get worried about this. Oh my God, why this is mentioned? But the dislikedness for some of these that I'll be mentioning next is because of what this state is rarely bereft of. So he says disliked for the imam to be a slave. It's not because of them being a slave, but rather because they typically wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn. But a learned slave would be given precedence over an unlearned free person. Or a Bedouin. Again, it's not because they're Bedouin and live in the desert, but again, because those who live away from the cities are more likely to be distant from knowledge and learning. But I say a learned Bedouin is given precedence over a non-learned city dweller. It's not about there being a Bedouin. Right? Or a blind person. Again, not because of their blindness, but for many people who are blind, they may not have had the opportunity to learn, and they might not know how to face the Qibla, like if they stumble or whatever, and they might not be able to avoid najasa if they're out and about a lot. However, if they're learned and they know about the times and facing the qibla and so on, then there's no dislike. And we have, the Prophet ﷺ himself deputized Abdullah ibn Maktoum, the blind companion, over Medina when he left, and he led prayer, right? So this is in the event of them being unlearned or unable to fulfill the expectations of that, then, it's disliked to choose to have a corrupt person lead prayer, right? Particularly an openly corrupt person, right? Even if they're learned, right? So if one has a choice, the imam over here, they're openly sinful, right? And we don't pry into people's affairs, and you don't listen to suspicions, but it's established. You've dealt with them. You know how they are. You have a choice between going on the left to questionable imam's masjid, and the other, you have an upright person, then choosing the corrupt person is disliked. But if the local masjid has a corrupt person leading prayer, it's better to pray with them, right? Or it's disliked to choose an innovator, a mubtadi', to be the imam, right? They belong to one of the sects, etc. As long as these sects remain within the fold of Islam, right? Now the sects that have veered, if someone is of the Sunni sects, it's better to pray behind them to pray on one's own, right? In the Hanafi school, a congregation of women alone is disliked, because it's not established according to the Hanafi school for women to pray in congregation, like in a women's only congregation. The female companions generally prayed at home, and in homes there'd be multiple family members together, multiple women together, and it's not related from them that they prayed together. And they're so avid, as we know from the female companions, to do whatever was best religiously. There are individual instances where some female companions led prayer. So though those are understood to be for the purpose of teaching, right? They taught other women, etc., by leading them in prayer, right? And this actually related from Sayyidah Aisha, that she said, "La khayra fi jama'atin nisa." There's no good in a women's congregation illa fil masjid, except if it be in the masjid, or for the janazah of someone who died. It's related by Imam Ahmad and others. But there's ikhtilaf about this with some of the other schools. The Shafi'is deemed it, recommended, etc. So we've talked previously about being soft-headed about matters of difference. Then how should people stand? If there's one person praying with the imam, they should stand right next to the imam, level with the imam, just behind with their heel only, not with their whole foot and not fully behind. It's makruh to do either one. So sunnah is to be on the right and level with the imam, just slightly behind the imam. If there's two or more, the sunnah is for them to be behind the imam, right? So if one person starts next to the imam, another person joins, they tap the person and they move back together. And it's best to move back and to be right behind the imam. The sunnah is for the rows to be balanced, right? It's not valid for a man to be led by a woman in prayer, because it's contrary to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And the command of the Prophet ﷺ that the men stand first, then the women, then the children, then the women behind, right? And it's not valid for a man to pray behind a child. There's some detail we talked about regarding Salat al-Taraweeh. You can review that lesson. And there's a few others, rare cases that are mentioned in the text. And it's not valid for someone praying a fard to pray behind someone praying a nafil, or behind someone praying a different fard. So let's say someone got to the masjid, they realized, I haven't prayed my dhuhr. They're praying asr. So you cannot pray dhuhr behind someone praying asr. Rather, you need to pray dhuhr and then catch them in their asr prayer, right? Right? So you cannot pray a fard behind someone doing their nafil. They finish their prayer, but they're going to do the sunnah. A sunnah can be prayed behind someone praying a fard. So you got to the musalla at work, and they just finished the congregation of dhuhr. So you could lead one of them who says, okay, I'll pray my sunnah behind you. And this way the person would get the reward of the congregation. So you can pray a sunnah behind someone praying a fard, but you can't pray a fard behind someone praying a sunnah. Right? Because there's a principle that you can't build the stronger on the weaker. You can't, لا يبنى القوي على الضعيف. And there's many examples of that across the chapters of fiqh. Then for there being following in the congregation, the jama'ah is from ijtima', is from coming together. So you have to be either in the same place or in a place considered adjacent, right? So the whole masjid is considered one place, right? Right? If the congregation is in one room, you could follow from the room right behind it, because it's adjacent to it. And if there's a small separation, so for example, the men are in one room, and there's a corridor, and the women are in the other room, but it's a small corridor. That doesn't prevent, because that's still considered adjacent, right? So you have to be in the same place or in a place adjacent. But if, let's say, the men are praying here at Seekers, and in the building over there, you want to turn right? So that's separated by our grass and the parking lot, and on the other side there's another building. The women are over there. Are they in the same place as the men? No. Are they adjacent to it? No, because there's a big gap, right? Now let's say the center is full, so people are praying outside, right? If it's adjacent, there's a small gap. We have to keep the entrance clear. So they're praying in the parking lot. Let's say we're allowed to do that, right? That's adjacent, right? So a small gap does not prevent a place being adjacent. A big gap does. So the author explains that following is prevented by a large road, which would be a road on which vehicles drive, right? as opposed to a path. Oh, you're praying from the other side of the street. Would you say they're praying together? Is it one congregation? No. Wouldn't, right? Because you're not in the same place. Across the road is not the same place, right? Or a river through which boats can cross, as opposed to a little stream, right? Now, what if you're out in the countryside? And sometimes you have to be careful. Some years ago we did a seekers picnic at one of the provincial parks, right? Or let's say we went to one of the parks here, and just not last year, the year before, we did some classes in the park. It was really nice, right? So let's say the women are standing way behind the men, so just to keep a safe distance. Now, if it's considered one place, right? One place, and there's a reasonable gap, but they're still in the same area, this is considered to be, you're in the same place. So we're under the trees over here, right? So the men are ahead, the women are significantly further behind. It's not per se a problem. But out in an open field, if the gap is more than 2 rows, that prevents following. So that's something that requires caution. Or if it's a situation where there's a wall or a barrier by which the followers can't follow the imam directly or indirectly. Right, so if you're praying in another room and there's a speaker, you can follow the imam because you can hear what the imam's doing, or you can follow the actions of the rows that are reaching you. But let's say we're praying outside and someone trips on the wire and the mic gets cut. Can you follow the imam now? No. So what happens? The congregation gets invalidated. So what do? You just have to restart the prayer, either on your own or you guys do another congregation, or go plug in the mic or the speaker. And if it was just a brief pause, you could just, the congregation is not invalidated, right? Let's say you got up from the prostration and you tripped on the wire, but you just plugged it back in. So are people still able to follow the imam? Yeah. But you tripped over the wire and you caused the speaker to fall down, and like, what do I do? And after 2 minutes you say, you plug it in, but now they're not, so, but that broke the following. So now if you realize that the imam's prayer was invalid, you need to repeat. And if you're the imam and you realize that you don't have wudu, for example, then the basis is you have to tell people, by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't have wudu. You guys need to pray again, right? Because if your prayer wasn't valid, then their prayer is built on your prayer. That's why one of the categories of people who shouldn't lead prayer is people who have waswasa, who have misgivings. Because it spills over, right? It makes other people miserable. Any questions here? Okay. So the next chapter is on the traveler's prayer, right? there are things that affect our moral responsibility, right? So there's things that are related to our mental capacity or our physical capacity, such as sickness. But then there's certain circumstances that affect capacity. And one of those is travel. And we'll be looking at the prayer of the sick soon. So travel is considered a type of hardship. Considered a hardship, right? Because one is outside one's regular routines. Generally people travel in groups, right? So there's the considerations of the group, etc. The mode of transportation may also present challenges with respect to prayer. So the Sharia has come with ease, right? That imagine if we had to make a judgment about how difficult is this travel and what type of transport, like had to do a whole mathematical equation to determine what dispensations you can take. Would people do it? No, right? So the underlying wisdom, underlying the rulings of travel is the fact that there's hardship in travel. But out of mercy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the dispensation general. That if an objective criterion, which is the distance you're traveling, is met, the rulings of travel apply to you. So that's part of the ease of our religion, right? Part of the ease of our religion. And it's connected in the prophetic teachings with the distance travel. Even though the hadiths appear at a superficial reading to be talking about a journey of 3 days. But a journey of 3 days, the Arabs demarcated the distance traveled in days of travel. That how long would it take a caravan to travel that distance? So a journey of 3 days, for example, let's say it's 48 miles, whatever, 78 kilometers or whatever. How many kilometers is it? Yeah, let's say 78 kilometers, roughly, right? That's how long it would take a caravan to travel. But even the old days, if you're on a horse, could you do that in a few hours? Yeah. Right? You could do that in, I don't know how many hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. But that would still be considered that you did a 3-day journey. Right? So the fact that you have faster modes of transportation, the ruling remains connected with that. So the author says that whoever goes outside their city limits, intending a journey whose distance is the traveling distance of 3 days, which is 48 miles, so 78 kilometers, they are considered a traveler, right? So a traveler is someone who intends a journey that is more than the traveling distance, on condition that they leave their city limits. So let's say you're flying to Istanbul. You live in Mississauga. At the airport, would you shorten your prayers? No. Because although you've intended a long journey, Istanbul is slightly more than 48 miles from Toronto, but what's the condition? That you leave your city limits. So that's something that people often make mistakes on, right? It's okay, I'm traveling, so at home they shorten their prayers. That's not valid in the Hanafi school. At the airport they shorten their prayers, but if the airport's outside the city, it depends. Some cities it's outside the city. If you said, okay, I'm starting my journey, then the airport's outside the city. So for example, in Amman in Jordan, the airport's outside the city. So at the airport you would shorten the prayer because you intended your journey. So if you are a traveler, it's wajib to shorten the 4 rak'ah prayers. While a traveler. So Dhuhr, Asr and Isha, which are the 4 rak'ah prayers, are wajib to pray as 2 rak'ahs. Why? Because Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha relates, and there's other hadiths about this, but just to give one hadith, that she said, كانت الصلاة مثنى, prayer was 2 rak'ahs. ثم زيدت في الحضر وأقرت في السفر. Then it was increased for those resident, after the Isra and Mi'raj, and it remained as it was for the traveler. So the original ruling is to pray 2 rak'ahs. So the 2 rak'ahs, the traveler was originally commanded to pray 2 rak'ahs. And that remained the legislation. There is difference of opinion about this. The Shafi'is give choice about praying 2 or 4, but this is the ruling in the Hanafi school, right? Unless one prays in a congregation where the Imam is praying in full, then one follows the Imam. And you remain a traveler until you reach a place where you intend residence, right? And a place where you intend residence is either your permanent home, right? Either your permanent residence. So let's say you live in Toronto, right? In the GTA, somewhere, right? So your home is always home. Like you're never a traveler at home, right? You're never a traveler at home. So a place can either be your permanent home or a place of residence or a place where you're a traveler. Any place, right, that you're staying would take one of 3 rulings, right? That you're either a permanent resident there, a place where you're staying. You're considered at home, or you're considered at home, or you're considered resident there, or you're considered a traveler there. So, and a permanent home, you can have more than one permanent home, right? Someone, alternates between living in Montreal and where they move for work, but they still consider their parents' home to be home. You can have 2 permanent residences, right? You still keep some of your stuff at your parents' home, etc., but you've moved out. But you still have that connection. It's possible. Some people maintain a home back home in wherever they're from, in Beirut or Karachi or Cairo or Johannesburg or Istanbul or wherever. They still have a home there. They've now moved to another country, but they keep that connection. You can have more than one permanent residence. You're also a resident in a place where you intend to stay 15 days or more without initiating travel. And people so let's say you travel to Istanbul for 18 days. You're going to be in Istanbul for 18 days. Are you resident in Istanbul now? With respect to the rulings of travel? Yes or no? Yes? There's a trick though. Right? That you're a resident if you intend to stay somewhere for 15 days or more without initiating a Shari'i journey. So let's say you go to Istanbul, but then you decide for 2 days you're going to visit somewhere that's more than traveling distance from Istanbul, even for 1 day. On day 7, you'll be traveling. So those 18 days in Istanbul, are you a traveler or a resident? Right? The definition of a place of residence is a place where you intend to stay 15 days or more without initiating a Shari'i journey. So someone comes to Toronto, and they're staying downtown Toronto, and they're staying here for 24 days. Are they resident? The first question to ask them, are you visiting Niagara Falls? Is Niagara Falls traveling distance from downtown Toronto? Yes. Right? That's typically where people go, right? So what happens, even though they're here for 24 days, if within the 15-day period they'll be initiating a journey, then they're still a traveler. Now, something that confuses people is, let's say you're living in Mississauga and you're visiting your aunt in Toronto. In Hamilton. Is Hamilton traveling distance from Mississauga? Is Hamilton traveling distance from Mississauga? It's like 20 miles from here. Is Hamilton traveling distance from Mississauga? So what's your ruling in Hamilton? Let's say you're spending a few nights at your cousin's place, 20 miles away. It's a different city. Where are you resident? Are you a traveler in Hamilton or a resident? It's a trick question. You're not resident in, are you a traveler in Hamilton? No, you're resident in Toronto. Like, your status is you're either considered to be at home or resident or a traveler. Right? So if I live in Mississauga and I'm spending 3 nights in Hamilton, which is less than traveling distance away, I'm still resident in, I'm still at home in, my status is, I'm at home, right? I haven't initiated a journey, right? You're only considered a traveler when you initiate a Shari'i journey, and then you remain a traveler until you get home or you are in a place of residence. So that's something that confuses people with respect to travel or residence. It gets tricky with people who live on campus, not far from home. Let's say London, Ontario. Do you guys have any universities there? What do you have? Yeah, you go to University of Western Ontario, right? Still called that? Right, so you go to Western. Is London traveling distance from Toronto? Yeah. Let's say someone is living there, but their parents are in Mississauga. Every weekend they come to Toronto. Is it traveling distance? Is it traveling distance? London to Mississauga? Yes. Then are they, let's say every weekend they come from London, Ontario to Toronto. Are they travelers for 4 years at university? Yes, but there's two opinions there, right? One is that yes, if at any time you don't intend to be there for 2 weeks in 2 weeks without initiating a journey, you are resident. You're a resident. And if you intend, well, I live here, but every weekend I'm going to Toronto, then you're a traveler. But some people get tied up in knots about that. Okay? So how am I a traveler? So, okay, then simple. Intend, I live here. Right? So there's a number of ways. You can just intend that for now, London is my home. Your permanent residence, it doesn't have to be your permanent residence forever and ever. Right? Just say, now, right now, because in Arabic called watan asli, it means your permanent residence. But your permanent residence is not your eternal residence. Your permanent residence is Jannah, inshallah. Right? So people get tied up in knots. So one thing, you just intend that this is my home for now. Who knows? Maybe I'll work here after I graduate. I don't know. That way you consider that as home for now. The fact that you're staying in a university dorm or whatever doesn't matter. Because is the homeless person still in Toronto? Yeah. Right? You don't have to have a fancy home to call it home, right? So that's a simple thing. You consider where you're living to be your permanent residence, right? And then just simplify. So, but that goes back to your intention. You can treat it as your permanent residence, this is my place of residence, right? And then you simplify. If you want to take the dispensation, you can. That no, every weekend I am going to Toronto. Okay, act accordingly. You can have more than one permanent residence. I'm living in London, Ontario. I consider that home right now, and I consider my parents' home to be home. Just when you visit your parents, make a good intention that you're visiting them to seek the pleasure of Allah, not simply to eat free food, right? And have gratitude to Allah for this, and to your parents for the food. Okay. The traveler should not pray in full. The traveler should not pray in full because wajib to shorten, right? But their prayer, if they prayed in full, is valid. But it's sinful in the Hanafi method. But there's difference of opinion, right? It's valid for the one traveling to pray behind a resident imam, and they follow the number of rak'ahs that the imam prayed, such that, let's say, you join the last rak'ah of prayer behind the imam of the masjid, who's resident. You're a traveler. So you enter the masjid, they're in the final sitting. So you didn't even catch one rak'ah behind the imam. How many rak'ahs do you pray? So imam's praying dhuhr. You got to the masjid right at the end of the imam's prayer. How many rak'ahs? But you're a traveler. You join the prayer in the final sitting. How many rak'ahs would you pray? There's only two options, guys. And you're not giving a fatwa, you're just answering a question like in class. Do they pray 2 rak'ahs because they're a traveler? Or do they pray 4 rak'ahs? Anyone online? Okay, let's say you're a traveler. You got to the masjid, right? So you're traveling from Toronto to Ottawa. You stopped in Kingston. They have a really nice masjid there. You got there for Dhuhr. It's the final rak'ah of prayer. Right? They're in the final sitting. You can tell by the way the imam is sitting, that is the final rak'ah of prayer. They're in the final sitting of the prayer. So you join the prayer, but now, as the traveler who joined late, do you pray 2 rak'ahs because you're a traveler, or do you pray 4 rak'ahs? No, you would pray 4 rak'ahs because the follower's prayer is built upon the imam's prayer. Right? The Prophet, and there's many hadiths about that إِنَّمَا جُعِلَ الْإِمَامِ لِيُؤْتَمَّ بِهِ. The imam has only been placed to be followed. So you follow the imam in that, right? So even if you missed all the rak'ahs of the imam, but you joined the imam's prayer, so you would make up 4 rak'ahs in that. You make up your prayer as 4 rak'ahs. What if, you didn't realize that you joined right next to a pillar. So you said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and you hit your head against the pillar and you lost consciousness. Right? So you're unconscious through Asr prayer. So you missed Asr prayer. You regain consciousness at Maghrib time. How would you make up that Asr prayer? Right? You make up prayers missed when traveling. The prayers missed when you are a traveler are made up as the traveler's prayer, even if you're resident. And prayers missed when resident are made up as resident. So let's say you're spending a week in Kingston because your car got hit by a deer and is being repaired. She said, I have 7 days. I'm out of my data on my data plan, and I'm staying at the house of this family that took me in. They don't have internet because they're anti-technology. So I have a lot of time. I'm going to make up missed prayers. Do you make the prayers up because you're a traveler right now? No, you make up. Prayers are made up as they were missed in terms of the number of rak'ahs. Okay, so that's one of the things related to travel as well. We're going to look at how you pray when traveling a little bit later, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Next class, we're going to look at the prayer of the sick and how one makes up missed prayers. It's a very important class. And the forgetfulness, prostration, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama taslima. Any questions before we end for today? Anyone online, inshallah?
I just have a question.
Sure.
The student that we talked about, the London Sisaba,
Yes.
who comes to visit his parents every week.
Yeah.
Will he now be the traveler in London and can he just pray to Rak'ah?
Yeah. Yeah, they can make that intention, right? That I'm a traveler. I every weekend I'm going to Toronto. I don't consider this home. That's fine, right?
But is it advised or recommended that you just pray, okay, I will consider this as my home after graduation, therefore I'll pay for the house?
Yeah, it may be better just to consider themselves that this is my home right now, right? That way, because otherwise people can get lax, right? So then I don't really need to pray in congregation, and it's counterfactual. You're living there, right? You're not like on you're not. If you tell someone, okay, I'm doing 4 years undergrad at Western, I'm a traveler here. You're living there, you shop, well, let's say you freeload, right? So you don't get all your food from your parents, right? But still, like you're there, right? So that would, Allahu Alam, that would be more practical and more cautious. Because then, and thing is, if you consider yourself a traveler, then if you're going to lead people in prayer, say, oh, but folks, I'm a traveler. Okay? So, but it can be considered both ways. So that's a good question. Jazakumullah ta'ala khairan. Any other questions? Go ahead.
That person considered London to be London Asli and then consider himself as a traveler when he goes to his parents' house?
No, so would they consider themselves a traveler when they go to the parents' house? Do you still consider, it goes back to your intention. Do you consider your parents' house to be home? And it depends. Yeah, you could have more. Like when we're in Damascus, initially, we considered we're resident in Damascus, but if we visited Toronto, we're visiting home. But then I made this decision a year into being in Damascus that I'm never returning to Canada. And we came for a short visit. I came for a short visit. I think it was my sister's wedding. And my mother, who notices these things, noticed that I was shortening my prayers. So she asked me, aren't you home? So being a foolish guy sometimes, I said, I don't consider Toronto to be home. My mother just gave me this look of like, you've broken my heart and shattered into pieces. But she didn't say anything. She just walked to my mother's reaction to these things to walk to the kitchen. So why are you upset? I said, why are you making me upset? Did I say anything? I said, no, right? So it goes back to intention, right? Of course, I didn't change my intention, because then I visited a number of times subsequently from Jordan, and I said, okay, I used to have the intention, I wasn't going to be coming back to Canada, except for visiting. So it follows one's intention. You can have more than one permanent home. Can you combine prayers when traveling? This is a matter of famous difference of opinion. In the Hanafi school, one does not combine prayers even when there's an excuse, right? And that's the Hanafi position, because the Hanafis took the command to pray in the Quran to be decisive, that inna salata kanat ala al-mu'mina kitaban mawquta. Truly, prayer has been made incumbent upon the believers in duly apportioned times. So each prayer has a time before which it is not valid and after which it's not permitted, right? And this is a matter that the Sahaba differed upon. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who's one of the most learned of the companions, says, Wallahi ma jama'a Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam salatan qat. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam never combined prayers. Innama qaddama salatan wa akhara salah. He only prayed one prayer early and the other one late. Meaning that he prayed one at the beginning of its time and the one before it towards the end of the time. So this is called al-jam' as-suwari, that it looked like combining. So on a journey, right, they would stop towards the end of Dhuhr time, pray Dhuhr, such that when the Dhuhr is finished, there's just a brief gap, and then they prayed Asr right after that, right? So that's a famous difference amongst the companions. This is the position of the Hanafi school. The Shafi'i school exists, and however, each madhab has its internal coherence, right? In the Hanafi school, travelers don't combine, but you're a traveler for up to 15 days. So you shorten for 15 days. In the Shafi'i school, the Shafi'is do combine, but they're only considered travelers for 3 days plus the day of arrival and the day of departure. So what you can't do is say, I'm going to combine for 15 days. Because who said that that's allowed? Right? And that frequently happens. People come to, for example, the RIS conference. So they come for the conference and then the retreat. So they're here for 2 weeks. And they stayed a few days for tourism, etc. So let's say they're here for 12 days. So I'm a traveler, I'm staying less than 15 days. But then you can't combine. Why? Because if you want to take a dispensation of another madhab, you need to do it soundly according to that madhab. Like, our religion is not a free-for-all, right? It just, because these are consistent legal systems. Like a lot of Canadian, it used to be, when I was at university, if you went to Buffalo to do your shopping over there, it used to be, or Niagara, I forget, either, in New York State, it used to be that generally you couldn't turn right on a red light. Can you turn right on a red light here? Yeah. If there's no traffic, you can turn right, unless it says no right turning. So all these people from Ontario would get ticketed. Particularly there's certain famous intersections. I don't know if it's still the case. We haven't gone there for that purpose. Can you use the argument, well, I live in Ontario? No, because each legal system has its coherence, right? So if you're following another legal system, you follow its logic, right? So if someone wants to combine, then you need to do it in a manner that's valid in the Shafi school. Someone, for example, who travels a lot, just find out what are the basic ways my combining would be valid according to the Shafi school. It just takes a few moments. People spend hours preparing. Like, I know people who, when they travel, they prepare the menu, like where they'll be going. Like, they map out their foodie trip. Okay, we're going to go to this restaurant on day 1, this restaurant on day 2, I remember when I went to Singapore, I was only there for first time. I was only there for a day and a half. My friend who was hosting the trip had planned out 12 meals over a day and a half. I had to say, please, can we skip some of these? You have to stop at this snack place and then we have to go here. I said, we don't have to do it. Right? It's like, have to is like darura. Right? It's not even a need. Right? But we plan out the little details. And I admit, like, if I'm traveling somewhere and I'm going to spend some time, I check out what are the best coffee places. And if it's near where some of the programs are, I was like, can we go to such and such coffee place? How do you know about it? Literally took 10 seconds, go Google, right? You say, best coffee shop in Cape Town. Okay. Oh, it's right by where we're going. We'll grab a coffee. You're going to buy coffee, might as well get a good coffee. Right? So we plan out all kinds of things, but we somehow find that just taking that extra step to find out about our religion, it's a burden. That's not, we should be glad to be doing so. Any other questions? So we'll be looking at how you pray when you're a traveler in a little bit. So next class we're going to look at the prayer of the sick person and then making up missed prayers. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. If it helps you, it's useful to be following along with the related chapters from Ascent to Felicity. We're not following the same text, but it can help bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.